All right, so just now that we're all here, I will give just a brief summary before we dive back into it. Our third session on Franz Rosenzweig and the return to Judaism. This year is going to be on Can You Hear the Call, or Can You Hear the Call of God's Love? But before we get to that, a brief summary of the last two sessions. As I mentioned, Franz Rosenzweig, brilliant Jewish German thinker. He experiences a crisis in his early 20s after he's completed his doctorate in philosophy. And what comes out of this crisis, at least initially, is a desire to convert to Christianity. In large part, this is because he doesn't see a future or even really a present for Judaism. As a religion, a way of life, it simply has no vitality in Germany as far as he can see. As I said, Rosenzweig is in many ways a religious man even before his personal crisis. However, he comes to believe that only Christianity can offer a comprehensive way of life, a way to be religiously in the world, at least as he sees it in his time, that can ultimately move the whole world towards redemption. Before he almost goes through with the conversion, he wants to attend high holiday services one last time. He attends an Orthodox synagogue, and at some point, probably in the days leading up to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, he makes this decision to remain a Jew. Last week, we saw the letter to his cousin Rudy Ehrenberg, who himself had converted to Christianity a few years before. Rudy was willing to accept Rosenzweig's decision to remain Jewish, but only if Rosenzweig could commit fully to being a Jew. He says to Rosenzweig, if you remember, that if you want to be Jewish, it must feel as if it is a commandment from God. This, of course, is a real challenge for Rosenzweig, because while he is not completely ignorant of Jewish texts and ideas, he has very little familiarity with Judaism as a comprehensive way of life. And he has much to learn. And his decision to remain a Jew is really just the beginning of a journey that he is on. In his letter to Rudy, Rosenzweig goes on to describe the nature of Judaism as one of returning, right? To be a Jew is to be in this perpetual process of return. For a Christian is born again through conversion. The Jew is born only once, and they're only born once as a Jew, but the Jew must keep finding a way to return back to Judaism. It's a constant process of tshuva, a return to God, a return to Torah, and a return to other Jews. And Rosenzweig points to the example of the Mishnah. Mishnah literally means repetition. Mishnah is about the oral Torah sort of returning to the written Torah, you might say. The Gemara is a return to the Mishnah, and again back to the written Torah. And again, he sees this dynamic playing out in all different aspects of Jewish life, right? The simple fact that we read Parshat HaShavua, we read the Parshiot week after week after week, year after year after year, in this cyclical repetition, right? The rhythms of being a Jew is a sense of return and repetition. Rosenzweig also raises this notion that it's this constant return and repetition that is what allows Jews to remain Jewish. It's like the gravitational force of God and Torah is what keeps bringing the Jews back, even if the Jews can't always understand exactly what that means. Jews still somehow keep finding a way to return. Rosenzweig also raises this idea that the Jewish people are am kshei oref, that they're a stiff-necked people. And while this idea is sometimes used in the Torah's criticism of the Jewish people, Rosenzweig invokes it as a compliment. Once Jews commit to something, they don't let go. And they've clung to God all these years, Rosenzweig points out, centuries and centuries, even after Christianity emerged in the world and said, the Jews are no longer relevant, even still, right? Despite being a despised minority in many places for many years, the Jews, no matter how painful it was, found a way to cling to God, right? That stiff-neckedness is what makes us cling to God so hard. Right? Jews are stubborn. When Jews make a decision about something, they stick to it. And they don't give it up easily. Today, I want to look at Rosenzweig's decision to stay Jewish from a little bit of a different angle than what we looked at last time, by exploring it through some of his philosophical writings. Now, some of the discussion today may sound overly abstract, and I apologize for that, but it will help us lay the groundwork for future sessions. So bear with me today. If today's a little too abstract, I apologize. Rosenzweig can be abstract, but we're going to see in the next several sessions how he takes these ideas and they become concrete. Going forward, we'll see how Rosenzweig understands the unique way in which modern Jews can do tshuva through a return to Torah as a text of revelation, right? Modern Jews have lost the sense that the Torah is a text of revelation. So his first point is, how do we get Jews to return to the Torah, to see it as divine in some way? He wants Jews also to return through the traditional act of Torah study, right? In his time, Torah study isn't Torah study. It's not Talmud Torah, right? In assimilated Jewish Germany, right, Torah study is an academic enterprise. Jews, professors, study Judaism as history. And he wants to bring Jews back through the process of actual traditional Torah study. And then the third dimension in which he wants Jews to experience return is through the performance of mitzvot, that a life lived bound to halacha can bring an individual into a relationship with God. And this is, again, something German Jews know very little about, because German Jewry doesn't really live any kind of rich Jewish practice. They left halacha a while ago, and what they're left with, most of them, is being 3-day-a-year Jews. The Judaism they know is primarily of the synagogue and a little bit at home. And that's obviously not Judaism. Judaism is a full, comprehensive way of life. So we'll look at the philosophical ideas today, but then we're going to explore in the sessions coming up how the return to Judaism plays out through these three different dimensions, through the Torah as a revelatory text, and how do we get people to see it that way? The experience of Talmud Torah, the traditional enterprise of Torah study, and the third dimension is through practice, through mitzvah, through halacha, feeling that obligation, and how that manifests in practice. To better appreciate the way Rosenzweig understands his Jewishness, what I actually want to do today is start by comparing Rosenzweig to a different German Jew, or to be more precise, an Austrian Jew, Sigmund Freud. And I like Freud and Rosenzweig as parallels. Freud's about 30 years older than Rosenzweig, but Freud also lives after Rosenzweig dies. Rosenzweig dies young. He dies when he's in his early 40s. Freud lives into, a ripe old age, more or less. So Freud lives before and after Rosenzweig. Freud is primarily in Vienna, in Austria, until he has to leave because of the Nazis and goes to London. So their experiences are not exactly the same, but they live in this profound transition moment where Jews really have to think about who they are and what they want to be in the world. And like Rosenzweig, Freud had this profoundly expansive view. He saw things most other people missed, and he developed new ways of thinking about what it means to be human. And the question of his Jewishness is a very, very relevant one for Freud, ironically enough. Freud is very much sees himself as a scientist. It's clear he has some sort of traditional upbringing. I wouldn't necessarily call it Orthodox, but it's clear he had some not insignificant Jewish upbringing, probably more so than Rosenzweig, to be honest. Freud, later on in life, though, really prides himself, like I said, on being a scientist and essentially an atheist, right? He's an avowed atheist. And much of what he does with psychoanalysis, particularly towards the end of his life, he directs psychoanalytic ideas towards religion, which he critiques essentially. If you don't know it, right, for Freud, God is an invention by human beings of an all-powerful father-like figure, because we all have this need to see our parents as all-powerful, and that's what we project basically onto this idea of God as a fantasy, he claims. So Freud has good reason to no longer be a Jew, but what's fascinating is that, like Rosenzweig, Freud can't quite seem to escape his Jewishness. And he's proud of his Jewishness, and he affirms it. Like Rosenzweig, it seems to be something that he can't escape, even though he might have good reason to. And you see this come out very concretely in the Hebrew translation of Totem and Taboo. Totem and Taboo is one, I think, can't remember when it's written, either 1919, maybe 1915, I forget. It's one of Freud's books on analyzing culture and development of society as he understands it in his own unique fashion. So 1930, the work is translated into Hebrew. It's basically translated before the state of Israel exists, obviously. So it's translated for the Zionists who now live in Israel. And there's a history of how psychoanalysis sort of makes its way to Israel. And when the book is translated into Hebrew, Freud writes an additional introduction. And here's what he says in the introduction. You'll see how he relates to his own Jewishness in it. Keep in mind, I'll point out here, what he notes in the introduction makes this very clear. He says he's ignorant of Hebrew, estranged from Judaism and all religion, and does not consider himself to be a Zionist, right? All the options for how you would hold on to Jewish identity are basically not options for Freud, yet somehow he remains a Jew. So here's what he says. He says, no reader of the Hebrew version of this book will find it easy to put himself in the emotional position of an author who is ignorant of the language of the Holy Writs, meaning the typical Zionist Hebrew reader is going to look at this book and they're going to have a hard time understanding Freud, because Freud doesn't know Hebrew, who is completely estranged from the religion of his fathers, right? Freud is totally distant from tradition, as well as from every other religion, right? Freud doesn't even think religion is like a legitimate thing, right? He thinks it's an illusion, is how he formally calls it. And who cannot take a share in nationalist ideas, right? Freud's not a Zionist really either. But, and here's the big but, who has yet never repudiated his people, who feels that he is in his essential nature a Jew, and who has no desire to alter that nature. That even though Freud doesn't espouse any sort of conception of Jewish identity as we recognize it, he still sees himself as a Jew, and he has no desire to change that. Just as when Rosenzweig had his collapse and he stripped everything else away, you strip away the academic and the German and all those pieces of himself, what he found at the end of the day was a Jew. And in a sense, Freud feels the same way. But if you take everything out of me, I'm still somehow a Jew, even if I don't know what that means. And he goes on to say, if the question were put to him, to himself, since you have abandoned all these common characteristics of your countrymen, what is there left to you that is Jewish? Like Freud, what are you going on here? Why would you stay a Jew? You take everything else away. What makes you Jewish? And he would reply, a very great deal, and probably its very essence. He could not now express that essence clearly in words, but someday, no doubt, it will become accessible to the scientific mind. Right? So he makes this very strange comment, even like I said, even though he considers himself to be a scientist, that when you strip everything else about him away, there's a Jew, and he doesn't know what that means, but someday, we will figure it out. So again, similar to Rosenzweig, but Freud's decision to remain Jewish is very different from Rosenzweig. Right? For Freud, his Jewishness is sort of like the end point. He's a Jew, whatever that might mean, and he goes no further beyond that. He's sort of trapped in his Jewishness. He doesn't quite know how to escape it. And that's similar to Rosenzweig, the sense that you can't escape it. But for Rosenzweig, that's the beginning of a much larger story of his Jewishness. For Freud, that's the end of the story. Okay, I'm stuck in it. It's who I am. That's it. For Rosenzweig, wait a second, I'm stuck in it. It's part of me, but bigger than me. And that leads him on this journey to try to understand what that can possibly mean. For Rosenzweig, his decision to remain a Jew is a beginning, not an end, like it is for Freud. It is recognition that he must live his life in a fundamentally different way than he did before he really owned up and accepted his decision to remain a Jew. More importantly, Rosenzweig recognizes that his Jewishness is not merely an ethnic or cultural category, but something that gives his life profound meaning. It is part of him, but bigger than him. And this is made very clear in a letter that he writes to his doctoral advisor, the great German historian Friedrich Meinecke, several years after Rosenzweig decided to remain Jewish. What prompts this letter, one second. What prompts the letter is that after Rosenzweig decided to remain Jewish in 1913, he kind of dropped off the map. He dropped off the academic map, at least. He no longer maintained connections with his professors, with his university. And this was surprising because Rosenzweig was so brilliant. And even though he was a Jew and couldn't necessarily get a professorial position, Meinecke was going to work to try to get him some kind of teaching position. But Rosenzweig, as I said, basically disappeared. And later on, he meets Meinecke, and Meinecke wants to know what happened to him. And this is Rosenzweig's explanation for what we saw last week. Meaning, this is Rosenzweig's description for his collapse and ultimately his decision to remain Jewish. And you'll see how for Freud, it was an endpoint. For Rosenzweig, it's a beginning. So he says this is his advisor, basically, his dissertation advisor. He says, in 1913, something happened to me for which collapse is the only fitting name. And we talked about this, the existential collapse, the personal crisis that Rosenzweig goes through. I suddenly found myself on a heap of wreckage. Or rather, I realized that the road I was then pursuing was flanked by unrealities. He realized when he has the collapse, the things he thought were meaningful were really not actually meaningful. That's what a collapse does. An existential collapse means that you had this whole way of looking at the world, the things that brought you meaning and an identity that you thought was solid. And then suddenly you realize it's not real, like that it's kind of empty. He goes on, he says, it was then, one can only speak of such matters in metaphors only, that I descended into the vaults of my being. He describes a descent into himself as he's trying to figure out who he is and what he's going to be, and ultimately struggling with the question of Christianity. And through that descent, he says, I approached the ancient treasure chest whose existence I had never wholly forgotten. For I was in the habit of going down at certain times of the year to examine what lay uppermost in the chest. He describes this interesting metaphor of descending within himself to sort of a treasure that he has within himself. And he doesn't really describe what that is, but that within himself, within his depths, he finds something that gives him meaning and gives him enduring meaning, right? So when everything else is collapsing, when everything else seems meaningless, he's able to find something hard and real and true within himself. And he's done this before, and this is a moment where he has to go in and do it again. He says, but now this cursory inspection no longer satisfied me. In the past, he used to just dig into the chest and grab some coins from the top. But now the crisis is too big. That's not sufficient. He says, my hands dug in and turned over layer after layer, hoping to reach the bottom of the chest. They never did. They dug out whatever they could. Then I climbed back again to the upper stories and spread out before me what treasures I had found. They did not fade in the sheer light of day. These indeed were my own treasures, my most personal possessions. So he talks about going within, descending deeply, trying to find a truth, an existential, objective truth that is hard and real and that he can build his life out of. And he's done that before, but now he has to go even deeper. And no matter how deep he goes, he comes out with more and more, right? There's a sense of descending internally and finding almost endless meaning. And when he brings it to the light of day, what he comes up with are treasures. And what he comes up with, it says here, my most personal possessions, things inherited, it should be not borrowed, sorry. Things that are inherited, not borrowed. The one thing I wish to make clear is that scholarship no longer holds the center of my attention, and that my life has fallen under the rule of a dark drive, which I'm aware that I am merely calling by calling it my Judaism. So what Rosenzweig ultimately discovers when he digs deep inside himself into that treasure chest within is my Judaism. Now, there's a few pieces about this I want to highlight because I think it's really interesting, and then we'll look into sort of the philosophical dimension of Rosenzweig's thinking that kind of captures this whole metaphor as well. So as I said, Rosenzweig discovers his Judaism deep inside himself, but at the same time, he recognizes a few key things. Number one, no matter how much he takes from it, there is always more to be discovered. There's no end to the meaning that can emerge from his Judaism, which is interesting, right? It's not like he figures out in that moment, this is what it means to be a Jew. You start keeping Shabbos, you go to shul every week, right? And be good to people and give tzedakah, right? I figured out what Judaism is, that's what I need to be. That's not the way he understands it, right? His Judaism offers a sense of like endless meaning and possibility, which is interesting. He says, while he doesn't state this, his Jewishness is like the Torah in the sense that it's open to infinite interpretation, right? The Torah has Shivim Panim, 70 faces of interpretation. The letters of Torah are open to all these possibilities of interpretation. And one gets the sense that for Rosenzweig, that's Judaism, right? That there's something there are letters, but the meaning that is imbued to it, right, is somewhat open-ended. He says, and it can't really be fully expressed in its totality. That's the first point. The second point, and this is also critically important, is that Rosenzweig's Judaism is not his alone. It's bigger than him. It existed before him, and it will exist after him. Because what he says here is the treasure that he finds within is not his own special uniqueness, but it's not that he descended within himself and found his own personal truth. That's not the case. When he says my Judaism, he points out that what he finds in his innermost treasure are things inherited, not borrowed. So whatever Judaism will mean to Rosenzweig, it's not a journey that he can walk alone. It's not his own personal truth. It will inevitably connect him to something that is far greater than himself, in order to make sense of it. It's going to connect him with other Jews, right? The meaning of Judaism is not something that Rosenzweig can determine on his own. It's going to have to be navigated and negotiated with others. That meaning is because, again, the idea of being a Jew is bigger than him. And I think this is significant because sometimes we imagine personal authenticity is about, we have our own special way of being in the world, right? We have to find our own unique way that's authentic to us, right? And that we are sort of the masters of our own destiny in terms of that. Rosenzweig recognizes that, however, when it comes to Judaism, it's bigger than us. It's not just a question of like, how do I authentically be a Jew, right? Because Judaism isn't something I necessarily get to define. So whatever this is, this Judaism, this Jewishness, it's bigger than him. And some of that meaning is not up to him. And he's going to have to navigate that, as I said, with others. And then the third point here is that he describes his connection to Judaism as being under the rule of a dark drive. Now, it's in quotes, right? So what does it mean to have a dark drive for something? What it means is that for Rosenzweig, his Judaism becomes something of an obsessive passion, right? An obsessive passion is something that you can't stop thinking about, right? You're focused on it all the time. You feel connected to it in ways that you can't explain. You want to be with it, whatever your passion is, all the time. And when you look at this, what also becomes clear, I think, is that for Rosenzweig, what he's also describing here is an experience of falling in love with Judaism, right? When he especially talks about this dark drive for Judaism, what he's saying is that he's had this experience of falling in love. And when you love something, when you really love it and you fall into love with it, right, you have this obsessive passion for it, and you're thinking about it all the time. And even when you're not with the one you love, you're thinking about them, especially in those early romantic days of love, right? You're thinking about them, you want to be with them, you feel connected to them in ways you can't explain, and you want to explore every part of who they are, even though you know that you'll never be able to uncover it all. And what's fascinating here too is that if Rosenzweig has fallen in love with Judaism, it's both a part of him and beyond him. And one of the fascinating things that happens when we fall in love is that it doesn't just keep the person external to us. When you fall in love, and we all know this from our experiences with our spouses and our children, right? It's as if they become part of you, right? They're part of you now, whether you like it or not. They sort of take up camp. They camp out in your interiority. And that's what you see here. Rosenzweig falls in love with his Judaism. He recognizes that it's a part of him and bigger than him. And he has this dark drive, this passion, this obsessive need to try to understand it and invest it with meaning. And like with any true love or passion, it can transform your whole life, and it can orient and ultimately give meaning to your whole life. So to summarize from this piece, Rosenzweig's return to Judaism is best understood as a falling in love with Judaism. And as we all know, love can transform our lives entirely. And central to falling in love, and this is the idea we're going to pick up with now, is the experience for Rosenzweig of being called by the other, by being called by the one who loves you. And that the experience of love is to hear that call of the other and to be able to respond to it. So for our purposes, what we're going to look at for Rosenzweig is this idea of the falling in love experience, the event of falling in love, and how that manifests by the call, and then ultimately the need to respond to the call. And I want to argue, at least on some level, this is what is playing out in this moment for Rosenzweig as he rediscovers his Jewishness. And many of these ideas come from the Star of Redemption, and they're basically revolve around the question of revelation, right? What does it mean to encounter God, to experience God? For Rosenzweig, that experience, that encounter, that event manifests through love and the call of the other, and our need to take responsibility for that call and to respond to it. So for Rosenzweig, revelation, the act of God turning to human beings, is best captured through, as I said, the experience of being called by another and the experience of falling in love, both of which essentially happen at the same time, according to Rosenzweig, right? Like this call and the falling in love, like they're kind of metaphors, one for the other. So I want to start with the call. That call, and the moment that we answer the call, is basically the moment that we fall in love. We can't really pinpoint when it happens, but in its aftermath, we know it's taken place. And Rosenzweig actually says this. He actually notes that you only can sort of realize love after it's already happened to you, right? It's so in the moment when it happens, it's not like even something we can easily pinpoint. But once it's happened, that moment we've fallen in love, and the moment that we've taken responsibility for that love, we know that it's taken place. And I hope like that we've all had this experience at some point in our lives, that love transformed our world when the one we love entered into our presence, to our lives. And, we were never quite the same forever after, whether it was a spouse or a child or a boyfriend, girlfriend, right? Somebody who came into our lives and we had that experience of love, and we were never the same afterwards. God's love for us begins with a call for Rosenzweig, not a prophecy. It's not a vision with all these images or words or a theological or mystical experience, but a call that penetrates into the depths of who we are. And to hear the call of God for Rosenzweig, and this is critical, is to hear God call out one's name. This is like the key element for Rosenzweig of revelation, right? Is when you hear that call of your name. And I want to understand, like, what does he mean? You have to hear the name being called. Why is that revelation? So here's what Rosenzweig notes about what it's like for us when we hear our name being called. And this is from a different book of his, Understanding the Sick and the Healthy, which is sort of like a summary in some ways of the Star of Redemption. And he describes here about the proper name and what it does to us to hear the call of the proper name, our name. He says, once again, it is language which erects the visible bridge from man to that which is not man to the other. If you want to connect to anybody else, it can only be done through language. And this is really important. Language is the bridge, not just between human beings, but between God and human beings as well, and human beings and God, right? God speaks to us, right? That's the experience of revelation. We speak to God, right? That's the experience of prayer. And ultimately, when we bridge the chasm that exists between us and other people, right, through language, that is love as well too, right? To love the other is to have this moment where things are bridged through language, but it's not language in the sense of like having a conversation with them. This isn't dialogue where you get to understand who they really are by listening to them and having empathy, and suddenly you love them, right? For Rosenzweig, love cuts beneath our conscious experience and very much pushes towards the unconscious. So when Rosenzweig talks here about having our name being called, he does not mean it literally. He means there's some part of us that is being captivated by the other and drawn into the other in ways that we can't explain, but nonetheless feel pulled towards. So what he says here is, language is what bridges between us. When then is a name required, and what happens to a man when his name is spoken? So what happens if language is the bridge between people and the name is really what functions as the bridge? What happens when your name is spoken? And he says as follows. He says, here again, the answer is simple. It can be seen most clearly in the case of I can't even pronounce it, somnambulist, somebody who's asleep, I think, or a person only half alive. He is forced into the presence of mind, to the internal, to himself. And where was he before? He dwelt in the past, and the external, completely dominated by it. He was a particle in the world ruled by laws which are always laws of the past and which always act from without. His name liberated him from these laws. So what Rosenzweig is saying here is that if you're half asleep, if you're not really paying attention, and suddenly you hear your name being called, it's like a jolt. It's like you're jolted awake, especially if you hear your name being called and you don't expect it, and you don't know where it's coming from, and you don't recognize who's saying it, right? To just hear your name out of the blue in a place and in a context you don't expect it, it's like a total jolt. It just awakens you in ways that we don't have that experience typically elsewhere. And that's why he says it liberates you, because we have this way of being in the world, this identity, this mask that we wear. But when we hear our proper name, right, the name that Rosenzweig goes on to say that only God knows, it's just like we're jolted up, like, whoa, somebody's calling me. What's going on here? Like, what is this? Rosenzweig continues. He says, when we hear the name, it recalls him from the world in which he was imprisoned and returns him to his self, which, once his name is uttered, is free of the past, devoid of the external. Suddenly hearing his name spoken, man knows that he is himself. He recognizes that he has the ability to begin again, right? If you can imagine, we have a certain identity that we wear in the world, but we know on some level that it doesn't represent who we are. And it rarely represents us in a deep way, right? I'm a rabbi. This is my job. I was a doctor. I was a lawyer, right? We give the whole spiel. Here's where I'm from. This is what I do. Here's my wife. Here's my kids. Here's where I live. Here are my friends. Here's what I like to do, right? Like none of that obviously can really capture who we fully are. And there's always depths to who we are that exist far beneath the surface. And the proper name, like our real name, is what touches us and awakens us very, very deeply. Like the best parallel I can maybe give here is imagine you like had a nickname that like your best friend or your mother shared with you, had for you when you're young that like nobody else knew. And then you grow up in the world and you get a job and you get married and you have kids and you get older and suddenly you're in your 40s or 50s and maybe your mother's passed away, you haven't seen your best friend in forever. And suddenly you hear somebody call you that nickname out of the blue, right? Like, and what it does is it basically takes you out of this identity that you constructed for yourself, that you're a father and that you're a lawyer and that you live here and that you do this and this is what Mondays look like and this is what Shabbat looks like. Suddenly you hear that name that nobody else knows and it just takes you out of all of that, right? You reminds you that there's an element of you that never can be defined by categories or ideologies. And when you hear that name, it reminds you of your own fundamental freedom, right? This part of you that is forever untouched by the outside world, but that it reminds you and awakens, the freedom and spontaneity and possibility that exists within you. So you hear that name and it wakes you up and it sort of jolts you out of the slumber of whatever sort of accumulated behavior and identity that you've taken on for yourself, right? That's what revelation is for Rosenzweig, to hear that name, to be awoken up and realize that who you thought you were and the way you thought the world needed it to be isn't exactly the case, that you can start again. There's a possibility of something new, something different. Now, in the Star of Redemption, Rosenzweig plays out how this is what revelation is, right? That when we hear the proper name being called to us by God, and when we hear that call of that proper name, right, that is the moment of the possibility of falling in love for Rosenzweig. Love inevitably enters our lives as a destabilizing force. And if the proper name wakes us out of our slumber and makes us think all those things we took for granted as the way the world had to be and the way we had to be, right? If the proper name shakes all that off of us for a moment, right, that's what love can do, right? Because love, as I said, can destabilize our world, can overturn everything. The possibility of falling in love is, especially as you get older, is like, it's profound and scary, because as you get older, the more we settle into, okay, this is the way the world has to be. And when you meet somebody who's older, who's fallen in love, and it really opens up the possibility that the world could be different from them, it's kind of shocking when you see it. I sometimes saw this with older congregants who maybe had a spouse pass away and then they remarried and you could see them fall in love again. And you could just see they almost became different people. And rather than seeing that as a betrayal of their past, what it actually shows is the possibility of how we always have the opportunity within us, that freedom to be expressed, to become something new. And there's something very profound of the way that love creates that possibility. To hear God's call is to experience the possibility of rupture and to see one's life as a veneer waiting to be stripped away so something new can be born. God gives us the freedom not to answer the summons of his call, just as we have the freedom not to answer the summons of love that we encounter from others around us. And that's what makes it so challenging. I don't know if any of you have ever been in a situation where you were with your partner. I mean, maybe I hope this hasn't happened. Where you were dating somebody or whatever, where they said, I love you. And you had that moment to decide whether you wanted to respond, I love you, right? The first time somebody in a relationship makes the declaration of I love you is a very profound moment, because when they say it, it's a loaded question or it's a loaded statement. And you have to determine how you respond, whether you feel that way, whether you don't feel that way. Have you been waiting to respond? Maybe you haven't, right? Can you say it authentically or not? It's a very profound moment. And you have the freedom not to respond. And the same is true with God, right? How do we respond to that moment when we hear that call, when we feel that possibility of love? And the first example where God calls out to human beings in the Torah, it doesn't go well. Rosenzweig points this out in the Star of Redemption. After Adam and Chava eat from the tree of knowledge and they have their own awakening, right? They discover their nudity and they hide. And when God calls out to them, he says, Ayeka, all right, where are you? Now, God knows where they are, but God is calling out to them in this attempt for relationship and for love, right? Which stands at the heart of God's desire throughout the Torah with human beings. And Adam and Chava don't respond, right? They're hiding, right? So we always have that opportunity not to respond to God's call. Probably the most fascinating or famous example of this in Tanakh is the prophet Yonah. Yonah is told by God to go to Nineveh and prophesy that the city's going to become overturned unless they do tshuva, and they're going to do tshuva. But Yonah doesn't want to take on that message. So when God reveals himself to Yonah, Yonah flees, right? Yonah does not want to answer God. So it's not inevitable that even when God, just like it's not inevitable when somebody says to us, "I love you," that we're going to respond. It's not inevitable that when God calls to us that we're going to respond. And for Rosenzweig, the classic example of the individual who is ready and willing and able to respond to God's call is Avraham. If the question that God asks is Ayeka, right, the answer is Hineni, right? That's the natural answer to Ayeka. Where are you? Hineni, here am I. And Avraham is the first one in the Torah to offer that answer. And it actually recurs throughout the Torah. God calls out to people by name. He calls out to Moshe by name. Moshe answers Hineni. God calls out to Shmuel by name, I believe, and Shmuel answers Hineni. Right? This idea of God calling out and people having that moment of whether or not they respond or not. And that is the very powerful moment. That's the moment where you experience the love of the other and you take responsibility for it. You say, I'm here, I'm with you, and I essentially it means I love you too. Now, Rosenzweig, this moment of Hineni, of saying yes, of answering the other, of hearing one's name being called and accepting the experience of falling into love, Rosenzweig also calls this tshuva, right? In German, it's the word Umkehr, which literally means reversal. And what Rosenzweig means by this is that to answer God's call is to cause oneself to turn around from the direction one had previously been heading, to go in a totally different orientation, right? To answer yes to love means one can no longer remain in the place one was before. Rather, one must turn towards one's beloved, regardless of where that might take them, right? So hearing the name and awakening to the total new possibilities of love in the other, like, means shedding everything you came from, and it means committing yourself to the other, not even knowing where exactly that's going to take you. And that parallels Avram so perfectly, right? Avram hears God's call. He leaves Ur Kasdim. He leaves everything he knows behind to go to this new land, for this open possibility of what does it mean to be in a relationship with God, him and Sarah together. And of course, even though God sort of lays out broadly what that future might look like, it's completely open-ended, because we all know that to hear that call of the other, the call of love, and even to respond yes to it, we don't know what the future holds, right? That's actually what makes the answering the call so scary, is because we know it fundamentally takes our future from looking like this and suddenly blowing it apart to be almost anything other than the simple fact we know that our beloved will be there with us by our side throughout the way. And that's what Rosenzweig describes here in the Star of Redemption: to hear God's call and to be able to respond Hineni, to be able to respond I am here to it. So I want to play out a little bit more the love dimension of this, and then I'm going to try to make it practical for us as we wrap up. Because again, this is a bit theoretical, a bit abstract, but we'll see how it plays out. The experience of falling in love, being captivated by the other, hearing the summons to love from the call of the other, answering Hineni, I love you back, and seeing how that is reflected in the process of returning to Judaism. So one more point that we really have to understand about the moment of revelation where one hears the call of love and responds yes to it is what exactly is in that call besides just our name. And there's another dimension to it beyond just the name. Maybe it's the tone of the name, you might say, right? If you're married, your wife could say, your husband could say your name, and depending on how they say it, it invests it with all sorts of different meanings. Like when your wife or husband is angry at you and they call your name, you can hear it right away in the way they say your name, versus when they love you, right? Just the way you say the name invests it with all sorts of meaning. And for Rosenzweig, it's very clear that when God calls our name, our proper name, the name of our soul, maybe that's the way I should be saying it, because that's the way Rosenzweig says it. When our soul hears its name being called and it awakens, right? It's not just, hey, Zach, how you doing, right? within the name itself, there's something more going on there that we hear. And in the text that I have here, this is again just a little bit later in the Star of Redemption. He says, the invitation to listen, the call by the proper name, and the seal of the divine speaking mouth, all this is only introduction, the preliminary to every commandment fully articulated beforehand, only so that it can precede the one commandment, which is not the highest of the commandments, but is really the only one, the only commandment, the only mitzvah that comes out of God's call, the sense and essence of all mitzvot, all commandments that ever may have come out of God's mouth. What then is this commandment of all commandments? The answer to this question is known to everyone. Millions of lips testify to it evening and morning. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. Right? That's the call. That's the mitzvah that we hear when God calls our name. And I would suggest here, what Rosenzweig is saying is not those are the words that come out of God's mouth. You must love me, but just the way that God calls our name. We know what God wants. God wants us to love God, right? The way God calls our name, it's like God says, "I love you," and God, it's in that name. It's as if God says, love me." And this is a really fascinating point Rosenzweig makes. It addresses this classic question in Judaism: how can we be commanded to love God, right? If a love is an emotion, it's not really something you can choose. How can we be commanded? So here's how Rosenzweig understands it. I think it's a very, very profound answer. Rosenzweig says, you shall love. What a paradox in these words. Can love be commanded? How can you command somebody to love you, love them? I mean, that just sounds absurd. However, isn't love destiny and being deeply touched? And if it is free, isn't it a free offering? Meaning, how could this love be this thing that could be compelled? And now it is being commanded by God. Surely love cannot be commanded. No third party can command it or obtain it by force. You can't compel somebody to love you. That's the opposite of love. No third party can do this, but the one can. The commandments of love can only come from the mouth of the lover, only the one who loves. But really he can say and does say, love me. From his mouth, the commandments of love is not a strange commandment, it is nothing other than the voice of love itself. So this is a very important point for Rosenzweig, that the reason we feel compelled to love God is because God says, love me. And this may sound a little strange, but again, we can best understand it from the experiences in our own lives, that a large part of what it means to fall in love with somebody, it feels as if they're calling out to you to love them, right? Oftentimes it's because they love you, right? When somebody really loves you and you can feel it with every fiber of your being, right? You cannot help be drawn into a relationship with that person. Sometimes that's scary. We want to push them away. But there's a flip side to it where it's also profoundly enrapturing, right? To have this experience where they love you and they love you so totally that you cannot help but love them back, right? Because that's what they want. That's their desire, and you feel it, and it has an effect on you, right? Maybe the best example of this is your kids, right? Our kids make the demand of us, spoken or unspoken, every day to love them. And we just feel it, right? We feel it the way they look at us when they wake up in the morning, and the way they look at us when they're not feeling well, and the way they look at us when they're struggling, right? They have this, they're exuding this command, this mitzvah of love me, and we just can't help but love them. And that's essentially what's going on here. When the lover, the one who loves you, demands back that you should love them, there's a part of you that just feels compelled, because that's what it means to fall in love with them. And that's why God can command love, because love is sort of strange that way. Love commands itself, right? You love somebody, it almost commands love in return. And that's the profound moment, the event of falling in love. And what happens after that is a sense of profound commitment and connection, right? Love, the moment of love, when we hear our name being called and we can answer it, and we answer it with love, right? Like just in the way that we say hineni, right? Just as the name is a call of love me, so is the response a response of I love you, even if it's just, name and hineni. It binds the two together. And as I said, for Avraham, his whole previous life is overturned, but he knows one thing going forward, that him and Sarah will be bound together to God, wherever that takes them. And in the life of the Jewish people, the love event, the revelatory event that sits at the heart of all of this is Sinai, is Har Sinai, right? The rabbis are very sensitive to this. You look in the Torah, in the description of Har Sinai, it does not look like a love event. That is not a depiction of a romantic date between God and the Jewish people. But that's not the way the rabbis envision it. They envision it as a moment of profound love and as a moment of marriage, right? A moment of God and the Jewish people being bound together into covenant, into brit, through this experience. And for Chazal, for the rabbis, right, they have these two paradigms. They think of Sinai. Sinai is either lifted up over the Jewish people's heads to be a chuppah, right, to be the marriage canopy between God and the Jewish people, and the giving of the Torah is the ketubah or the ring, or the mountain is being hung over the Jewish people's heads. What's the alternative explanation? The one we are most familiar with, right? Har kigigit. It's like being lifted up, and God is threatening to basically smash them underneath it if they don't accept the Torah, right? So this love event of Sinai is this moment of both compulsion, but also falling in love, right? We feel like we can't say no, but the Jewish people also say na'aseh v'nishma, right? That we're entering into this of our own free will. And love always has this dialectic between compulsion. I feel it. I don't know what to do. I have to accept it, versus like, I'm choosing this. Like, I'm going to love them because I can and I want to. And somehow both of those contradictory experiences go together. And Sinai is the event of love where God calls out to the Jewish people. God says, I'm Yisrael, and the Jewish people say, Hineni. And of course, at the heart of Sinai is that being bound to God and feeling that compulsion to God, right? That God loves us, we love God, we want to do what God wants, right? That's the heart of Sinai. That's in many ways the heart of being a Jew, is feeling that sense of not just responsibility, but an inextricable connection to the desire of the other, right? And whatever they want, we want to do, because that's what it means to be in love with somebody. You want to make them happy. You want to give them all that you can ultimately. Now, this is where it takes us to Rosenzweig going forward, and we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes. For Rosenzweig going forward, the covenant, our relationship to God, the Torah, and the Jewish people becomes this ongoing relationship through which we have the potential to hear God's call to us. Right? God called out to Abraham. God called out to the Jewish people at Sinai. We don't need further moments of revelation. Rosenzweig is very clear about that. We don't keep experiencing revelation in the moment per se as a people. That happened historically with Abraham, and it happened historically with the Jewish people at Sinai. But nevertheless, because we are born into the covenant, it's like being born into a marriage, we also have the potential to experience God's call to us. And this is significant because remember I said Freud felt like he couldn't stop being a Jew, but being a Jew really had no meaning for him. For Rosenzweig, he can't stop being a Jew, but being a Jew is the beginning of a long journey. And part of that journey, what makes that journey real for him, is that it contains the possibility of hearing God's call to him, as all Jews can when they pursue the covenant, when they pursue the brit in the fullest sense of the word. And what Rosenzweig is discovering, or really rediscovering as a Jew, what he calls my Judaism, his dark drive, it's God's call to him, a call that emanates forth from the covenant that every Jew has. Rosenzweig makes the decision to answer yes to this call when he decides to remain Jewish, just like the Jewish people at Sinai did when they said na'aseh v'nishma. He obviously doesn't quite know what he's getting himself into when he makes the decision to remain a Jew, just like the Jewish people didn't really know what they were getting into at Har Sinai, just like none of us really know what we're getting into when we say yes to love, right? Because like that's what love is. It means this profound openness to what's going to come next, and you don't know what's going to come next because it means life is going to look different because you're now bound to another, and what you realize, all those things you thought were true about yourself are maybe not so true to the end. Like love, what makes love is in no small part that it points to an open-ended future. We know or hope that our beloved will be there with us, but everything else in our lives may very well change. If revelation is the call to love, and covenant is the moment that we answer yes to love, then the aftermath of revelation is best understood as a marriage between the two sides. And this is very clear for the rabbis, very clear for Rosenzweig, that when you say yes to love, when you bind yourself to the other, when you bind yourself in responsibility to the other's desire, that's what marriage is fundamentally. And what makes marriage at the end of the day, Rosenzweig is going to point out here, is not the formal actions that initiate it. It's not the chuppah. It's not the marriage ceremony. And it's not even the formal things that we, husbands and wives typically do, right? The husband takes out the garbage, the wife, cooks, or, people have their formal roles. That's not what makes marriage. What makes marriage, and I think we all know this, is the way in which it enables us to be, or it's a reflection of the fact that we are unconsciously bound to the other, that we can't escape them, right? When you're married, like, you feel your spouse wherever you are in the world. And when you're home with them, it's almost like you have this like psychic connection to them, right? They're in your head and you're in their head, and you can't escape each other. That's what marriage is. The way we are, that's what love is, the way that we are unconsciously bound to others. That's what makes love so scary, because like I said before, you're giving them the permission to camp out in yourself. Like that's a lot. Like, who wants to really do that at the end of the day, to give up our freedom by letting somebody else, camp up or pick up shop in ourselves. And that's what Rosenzweig says here in a much later letter that he writes towards the end of our life. He says as follows. He says, what we can thus state about our relationship with God as Jews is related to our possible experience in the same way that the empty announcement that two people have gotten married, or the showing of the marriage certificate, is related to the daily and hourly reality of marriage. Meaning, you want to talk about faith. You want to talk about whether the Torah was given by God or not. You want to try to define these things in historical or objective terms. You can do that, but they are as authentic to what a relationship with God really is as the marriage certificate is to marriage, right? You can hold up your marriage certificate and say that you're married, but that's not what makes somebody married. What makes somebody married is that love that fundamentally binds the two together. Like I said, the psychic connection that you have with each other, the way that you feel bound to the other's desire in ways that you can't always explain, and that cause you to act in ways you don't even understand sometimes, right? That's what marriage really is, the sort of unconscious dimension of it, not the formal certificate or the formal marriage ceremony. He goes on, he says, the reality cannot be communicated to a third person, right? The way in which we are bound to others through love is never something that can be communicated objectively. It is no one's concern, yet is the only thing that counts, right? You can't describe it to others, but it's the only thing that really captures the essence of what does it mean to be bound to the people that we love. And the objective statement of the fact of the marriage would be meaningless without this most private, incommunicable reality, right? That sense of being loved and bound to them. And so even the bare fact of marriage does not become real, save when it leaves the spheres of what can be objectively stated and enters the secret pale of the festive days and anniversaries of private life. And what Rosenzweig is basically saying here, there's the formal dimensions of marriage that people see on the outside, and that you even sort of see on the inside, but there's a deeper hidden dimension to marriage, what he calls here the festive days and the anniversaries of private life. It's the day-to-day reality of living with the one you love and being bound to them, and how that shapes who you are and they are, as I said, in ways that you can't ever describe. The way that you're bound to them psychically, they're bound to you. The way that every couple has their own unique way of being together. You have to accommodate the other, right? I do it this way, you do it that way. I want to do it this way so it doesn't upset you. I want to do it this way so that I can make you happy. And what emerges from this profoundly complicated dynamic is somehow two that are bound together in ways that, again, neither one can fully always point out where one ends and the other begins. But it's that unconscious dimension of the way that we're bound to the other and can't escape them and their desires and our desires for them that gets at the heart of what marriage is. And for Rosenzweig, ultimately gets at the heart of what faith is. If when Rosenzweig decides to remain Jewish is the moment that he rediscovers his love for Judaism and God and Jewish people as a Jew, it's that moment of falling in love, hearing his name being called and answering Hineni, right? What goes on for the rest of his life is that attempt to make a marriage out of it, right? To now take this bond that he has, this covenant, and try to understand what it means to make it real with God and with the Jewish people. And the complicated side of that relationship, right? Every marriage is complicated. Every marriage has its pathologies. Every marriage has its perversions, even you might say, right? The things that you don't talk about with others, but it's the way you and your spouse talk to each other and act with each other, the cute things you do, the weird things you do, just the ways that you are uniquely and singularly bound to each other. That make a marriage a marriage. That's what Rosenzweig now has to discover with his Judaism. At the heart of that is again, not just taking responsibility for it, but also feeling that call, that continual call, and that continual mitzvah, right? What's at the heart of the Torah is this idea of mitzvah, right? Obviously, there's 613 mitzvot, but when you strip that all the way, it's mitzvah, right? Without mitzvah, there's no Torah. Without mitzvah, there's no relationship. If you don't feel a sense of compulsion to the one you love, then you're not really in a love relationship with them. And that's very important for Rosenzweig. So what we're going to see in the coming sessions, and again, I apologize if this was overly abstract and philosophical in a sense. What Rosenzweig dedicates his life to is wanting to help German Jews hear God's call to them so that they can fall in love with their Judaism once more. They can hear that call from God through the covenant and be ready to say Hineni to it. And as I said, there's three dimensions to this that Rosenzweig is going to try to help German Jews hear God's call. The first one is through a major translation project that he takes on, where he translates the Torah into German for German Jews, specifically to translate it in the kind of way that will allow them to experience it as a revelatory text, as a divine text. He wants to translate it so that they can feel the divine within it. And we'll have to talk about, what that means later on, because if Rosenzweig can help make it a divine text for them, they'll be able to hear God's call within it. That's one, through their experience of the Torah, through the translation of the Torah. The second one was through learning, through Talmud Torah. Rosenzweig opens up what's called the Lehrhaus, like not a secular Beit Midrash, a Beit Midrash, but not for all Jews. And he wants to make Torah study, text study, something that's possible for all Jews. And again, this vehicle through which they can hear God's call to them so they can return once more. And again, that we're used to. I mean, people return to Judaism through Torah. We get that. But Rosenzweig has his own unique take on what that would look like. And then the third dimension is through mitzvot, through halacha. And this, in a sense, is maybe the most controversial. It's easier to feel God's call to us through Torah, through learning, but hearing it and feeling it through mitzvot, through halacha, is always harder. But what I think is significant that we have to keep in mind here is that when you love somebody, when you are in a marriage, you are always bound to them in ways that you can't express, and you're always obligated to them in ways that you can't fully articulate. And to live a life of mitzvot and halacha is to take full responsibility for the love that one experiences from God, and one feels responsible to give back to the other. And that's the last piece that we'll look at. And as I said, a lot of dimensions here, but I think, hopefully we can start to unpack how we can essentially experience these possibilities even within our own lives as religious Jews.